The sacred city of Jerusalem, one of the holiest places on earth, is too often the scene of passions, protests, and violence. In the modern era, we're used to seeing the Palestinian people rising up and launching intifadas to shake off what they see as the yoke of oppression. But in ancient times, it was the Jewish people who regularly rose up against a foreign occupier, and time again the rebellion led to catastrophe, and ultimately to the diaspora, or the spreading of the Jewish people across the world. I'm going to take you from the Bronze Age all the way through to the time of the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who expelled the Jews from Jerusalem and renamed the entire province Palestine. Jerusalem lies on a plateau in the Judean mountains, a natural fortress with Mount Zion as its citadel. Yes, that's Zion as in Zionism, the movement for the Jewish people to return to the Promised Land. The first people to occupy this spot were the ancient Canaanites, who date back to the Bronze Age and who were one of the earliest peoples to inhabit the Near East. The Canaanites were a sophisticated people who developed an early alphabet. Their deities included the chief god El and Baal, the rider of the clouds. Around 1200 BCE, the Israelites came on the scene, led, according to the Bible, by the patriarch Abraham. Abraham came from Ur in Mesopotamia, that's modern-day Iraq. One day God spoke to him and said, "To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river Euphrates." Well, isn't that a nice chunk of promised land? It includes modern Israel, of course, part of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and perhaps part of Iraq. It's sometimes referred to as Greater Israel. Abraham chose Hebron as the place to pitch his tents and set up his altar to God. In the time of his grandson Jacob, the Israelites moved to Egypt due to famine. But they did not waste their time there. They went forth and multiplied, and with their greater numbers they became a formidable force. Later, Moses led them out of Egypt, picking up the 10 Commandments on the way.
Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day.
Joshua, the successor to Moses, began the conquest of Canaan, first targeting Jericho on the west bank of the River Jordan. Joshua's forces marched around the city, blew their trumpets, and the walls fell down. The Canaanite city was destroyed, seemingly by the hand of God. But there was still plenty of fighting to be done because the Philistines had arrived, probably from the island of Crete. These Philistines started to build cities along the coast of Canaan in what we now call the Gaza Strip. Inevitably, they came into contact with the Israelites. Around 1000 BCE, David, a shepherd boy from Bethlehem, defeated the giant Philistine warrior Goliath using just a pebble. It was the archetypical story of a plucky underdog taking down a big bully. This boy David grew up to be the king of the Israelites. He conquered the citadel of Zion and made it his capital. He called it the City of David. Later it became known as the City of Peace, or Jerusalem. And the name perhaps has a certain divine irony to it. It was David's son, King Solomon, who built the monumental First Temple around the year 960 BCE. Solomon's temple took 7 years to complete. Much of the work was done by skilled Phoenician craftsmen. Based in Lebanon, The stones were fashioned at the quarry so that no hammer or chisel was heard in the temple while it was being built. On the inside, fragrant Lebanese cedar wood panels were carved with cherubs, palms, and open flowers. Then the carvings were overlaid with gold. The Holy of Holies was separated from the main sanctuary by some steps and by a thick curtain. It was a perfect cube, and it was known to be the earthly dwelling place of the Lord God. No human being was allowed to enter it apart from the high priest, and he was only allowed to enter it on one day a year, the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. Inside the Holy of Holies was kept the Ark of the Covenant, and inside the Ark of the Covenant were 2 stone tablets, on which were written, by the hand of God, the 10 Commandments. Solomon was known for his wise judgments and his proverbs.
A person who lacks self-control is like a city whose walls are broken through.
Solomon's trade extended to Arabia, Africa, and possibly even India. His ships brought back gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. He was visited by the Queen of Sheba, possibly from Yemen or Ethiopia. She arrived in Jerusalem with a large caravan carrying spices, gold, precious stones as gifts for Solomon, praising the king, his wisdom, and his God. But we should not mistake the kings David and Solomon for saints. They were anything but. They pushed the idea of living like kings to the limit. They had dozens of wives and hundreds of concubines. They had gold, myrrh, frankincense, and luxury food, anything you could possibly imagine. And they paid for all this with heavy taxation and forced labour. And as it turned out, not everyone was willing to put up with this situation forever and a day. Following the death of King Solomon, 10 northern tribes split off from the kingdom of Judah with its rapacious capital, Jerusalem. They called their northern land Israel. Their rebel leader, Jeroboam, set up 2 golden calves in the cities of Bethel and Dan. He declared these to be the gods who had brought the Israelites out of Egypt. And in the view of the prophets, the northern tribes received divine retribution for breaking the commandments. In the late 8th century BCE, the Assyrian Empire captured the northern kingdom of Israel and dispersed many of the Israelites over the empire. This ethnic cleansing was the first diaspora. Those 10 lost tribes were never to be found again. In 701 BCE, an Assyrian army laid siege to Jerusalem. According to the Bible, an angel of the Lord struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in their camp. But the truth is probably far more prosaic. According to Assyrian records, Jerusalem paid a huge tribute, otherwise known as a bribe, to the Assyrians to go away, which they duly did. But nonetheless, the kingdom of Judah, its capital Jerusalem, and its 2 Jewish tribes remained intact. Empires, well, they come and they go. Next, out of Mesopotamia, came the revived Neo-Babylonian Empire. Jerusalem was forced to pay tribute to Babylon, though it rebelled on several occasions, eventually leading to disaster. In 586 BCE, King Nebuchadnezzar II laid siege to Jerusalem for the 3rd and final time. The siege caused intense hardship and famine for those inside the city walls. Then catastrophe. The Babylonians breached the city walls, captured King Zedekiah, and executed his sons before his eyes, then blinded him and took him to Babylon in chains. Finally, Nebuchadnezzar's forces looted and destroyed Solomon's fabulous temple that had lasted for 400 years. But these terrible sins did not go unpunished, at least according to the Bible. Nebuchadnezzar later went mad, was driven from men, and ate grass like an oxen. A large portion of the Jewish population, particularly the elite, priests and skilled workers, were forcibly deported to Babylon. This event is known as the Babylonian exile, and it lasted around 47 years. While in Babylon, the exiled Jews wrote Psalm 137, which, even if you don't know it from the Bible, you may recognize if you're into 70s disco music. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. But the writing was on the wall for the Babylonian Empire, quite literally. When the Babylonian king Belshazzar held a feast and drank from the sacred goblets stolen from the temple, a hand appeared on the wall and wrote,
Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin.
The message was clear. Belshazzar's days were numbered, and the time of the Babylonian Empire was up. In 539 BCE, the Persian king Cyrus the Great captured the city of Babylon. And then there was a kind of real-life miracle. He allowed the captive Jews to return to their longed-for Zion. The decree of Cyrus, inscribed on a cylinder, survives in the British Museum. A copy stands inside the United Nations building in New York. It describes Cyrus's policies of religious tolerance, and some consider it to be the first declaration of human rights. So the Jews returned out of exile, at least this time. Back in Jerusalem, they completed the Second Temple in 516 BCE. But it was nowhere near as lavish as the Temple of Solomon's times. Old men wept when they laid eyes on it and recalled the splendor of the original. It was during these times of the Persian Empire that a notable Greek travelled along the coast on his way to Egypt. His name was Herodotus, often dubbed the father of history. When discussing the conquests of the Persian king Cambyses, he noted, "The city of Caditis, which belongs to the Syrians of Palestine." Alexander the Great's conquest in 332 BCE brought Greek influences to Jerusalem. Jerusalem came to be ruled by the descendants of Alexander the Great's generals, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, establishing Greek-style cities, theatres and gymnasiums, complete with naked athletes. Even the Bible was translated into Greek. Initially, the Seleucids were supportive of Jerusalem as a centre of Jewish culture, but King Antiochus IV was a very different kettle of fish. He set his greedy eyes on the tempting treasures of the temple. In 167 BCE, his soldiers entered the temple, looted its treasures, and set up an altar to the Greek god Zeus. He even sacrificed pigs in the sacred area. This outrage or desecration of the temple sparked the Maccabean revolt. The revolt was led by a Jewish priest and his 5 sons, particularly Judah Maccabee. The Maccabees recaptured and rededicated the temple in 164 BCE, an event commemorated by the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. Hanukkah is a festival of light and hope, celebrating the relighting of the menorah inside the temple. Simon Maccabee was proclaimed a leader and high priest in 140 BCE. This marked the start of the Hasmonean dynasty. It was a period of independence for the Jewish people. But all the while, a new superpower was rising out of the West. Israel and Judah came under Roman control in 63 BCE, when General Pompey the Great annexed the region. The Romans later installed Herod the Great as a client king in 37 BCE. Herod backed the wrong side in the Roman Civil War, a potentially fatal mistake. He remained loyal to his friends Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, who were defeated by a wily young Roman politician, Octavian, who was later to become the Emperor Augustus. In this crisis, Herod kept his head. He got in a boat and sailed to the island of Rhodes, where Octavian had installed himself. When Herod came into the presence of the future Emperor Augustus, he took off his crown and laid it at the feet of the young victor with the words, "Think not whose friend I was, but what kind of friend I am." Well, Octavian was impressed by Herod's chutzpah. He picked up his crown and replaced it on Herod's head. And indeed, the future Emperor Augustus was friends with Herod. In fact, Herod's children, some of them at least, grew up in the palace of Augustus in Rome. And even after Herod died, his descendants were friends with the descendants of Augustus. They partied together, they shared the same tastes and some of the same perversions. It was a very successful lobbying effort on the part of the province of Judah. Herod the Great glorified the Second Temple, aiming to make it the equal of Solomon's. He used marble and gold and constructed grand colonnades, gates and courtyards. He also rebuilt much of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was at the height of its splendor, but it also lost some of its political influence. Herod the Great also built a new coastal city with an impressive harbour that made it a trade and administration hub for the Romans. Caesarea Maritima was named in honour of Augustus Caesar. Herod the Great died in the year 4 BCE. His kingdom was divided between 3 of his sons and his sister. And indeed, one of those sons, Herod Antipas, is the Herod we hear about in the Bible in relation to John the Baptist. For this was indeed the time when Jesus was alive. And the name of Jesus is associated with Jerusalem mainly through his death around the year 30 of the Common Era. And in those last days of Jesus' life, he predicted the destruction of the Second Temple. Some of his disciples remarked how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, "The time will come when not one stone is left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down." In the Bible's accounts of the trials of Jesus, we see the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate interacting with the Jewish authorities, including the Sanhedrin and King Herod Antipas. He seems pretty frustrated, but nonetheless he wants to be diplomatic and to maintain the peace. Well, in the year 44 of our era, the Romans took direct control of the province. It seems that the shifting sands of Roman politics no longer favoured the Herods. And indeed, the procurators who governed Judah weren't particularly subtle, and they were interested in enriching themselves and taking bribes. People weren't happy, and trouble was on the way. This Roman insensitivity culminated in the Great Jewish Revolt of 66 to 70 CE, about 35 years after the death of Christ. Revolts against the Roman Empire followed a very predictable pattern. Initially, the rebels would enjoy a string of successes attacking Roman outposts. However, the Roman response was inevitable. It came very slowly because the Roman army marched on foot, and it had to march a very long way to a distant province. But when it arrived, it provided shock and awe. In 70 CE, Titus, the son of the Emperor Vespasian, was given command of the Roman legions. The Romans used siege engines, battering rams and catapults to breach Jerusalem's formidable defences. On Tisha B'Av in the Hebrew calendar, the Second Temple was set ablaze and destroyed. It had lasted about 600 years. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, who took part in these events, the destruction of the temple was accompanied by massive slaughter and devastation, and afterwards many Jews were sold into slavery. And of course, the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of our era was one of the most important events in the history of the Jewish diaspora. After the fall of Jerusalem, Masada, a fortress built by Herod the Great on a plateau overlooking the Dead Sea, became the last stronghold of Jewish resistance. In 73 to 74 CE, Roman forces besieged Masada. The Jewish defendants, known as the Sicarii, chose mass suicide over surrender. Now you might think that even the most rebellious Jewish people would give up at this point. It was clear that resistance against Rome was futile. But not quite. In 115 to 117 CE, the Jews in the diaspora, particularly in Cyrene, Cyprus and Egypt, rose in what is known as the Kittos War. The revolt was brutally suppressed by Roman forces, resulting in further devastation and loss of life. And then, in 132 CE, yet another revolt, led by Simon bar Kokhba, was put down even more severely by the Emperor Hadrian. The rebellion resulted in immense loss of life, with estimates of Jewish casualties reaching hundreds of thousands. Judea was left devastated, with many towns and villages destroyed. Hadrian renamed the province from Judah to Syria Palestina. The name Palestina dates back to at least the time of Herodotus. He even renamed Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina. And the Emperor Hadrian forbade the Jews from entering their sacred city, except on one day of the year, Tisha B'Av, to commiserate the destruction of the Second Temple, a poignant reminder to them of the folly of taking on the might of Rome. And as a final insult, he set up 2 pagan altars on the Temple Mount. One was to the chief Roman god Jupiter, and the other was to himself, the deified Emperor Hadrian. And this is where I'm going to end this history of the diaspora and the expulsion of the Jews from Jerusalem. Some Jewish people did still remain in the area through the next 2,000 years of history, and at various times they drifted back, especially after the Spanish Inquisition and the pogroms of Eastern Europe. But I think we can say it was only in the 20th century that they returned in any great numbers. They were initially, of course, refugees from the horrors of Europe, and perhaps most of those who come today might be termed settlers. But whether this ancient history and these sacred texts give them a right to this land today, well, I'm going to leave that up to you to decide.